So, Cindy and I are members of the Otter Creek Poets Workshop in Vermont. And I'll tell you something that's not on her biography that I recall from several years ago. And it's this. The Vermont magazine always hosted a contest called the Ralph Nading Hill Award. Um, it was called that. And what happened was Cindy won it for 2 years. And after that, they decided that that was not allowed, that people could only win once and submit once. Do I have that right, Cindy?
Yes, yes, you do. Yeah, because it's judged anonymously, and then so they changed the rules
Yeah,
after that.
yeah. So, as you have seen, Cindy has an extensive writing background in both poetry and prose. She's had 4 books of poetry published. She writes essays, she writes short fiction, she writes for magazines, she edits, she does journalism, and she has now an MFA in writing. So her her long history of writing started very early at the age of 13, and she won local and regional awards for newspaper and magazine journalism. She's also a public interest environmental attorney, which allows her to write over 20,000 words every week. And as she said, the language has to be precise and concise and emotionally and intellectually persuasive. And of course, that relates to poetry and prose too, I think. And she's a freelance editor. And I'm just blown away with the amount of work you did, Cindy, for this particular topic called the right word, texture, and subtext in your poetry and prose. So, Cindy, it's yours.
Thank you, Deanna, and I am thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled to be here in National Poetry Month. There's so much going on this month with so many readings and workshops, and I'm so delighted to be here as part of that excitement. Let me see if I can share. I can. Look at that. I can share my screen. So I have a little PowerPoint. I have my contact info there and in your packet as well that hopefully got emailed out to you. Can everybody see that all right?
Yes.
Okay. And we're gonna have some discussion here. I know you were asked to mute, and certainly if you've got like, a dog barking or something and you want to mute, that's great. But otherwise, especially when I'm screen sharing, I can't see everyone. So just jump in when we're having discussion. There aren't too many of us here, and I think that'll work just fine if people just chime in. So I've got a busy morning here. I'm very grateful for this extra couple minutes. And just to clarify, we're hard stop at noon, right? Is that correct? Okay,
Yeah.
and I want to leave some time for questions there too. So these extra couple of minutes are very helpful. We're not going to get through everything that I had there, but we'll give it a good shot and share some information. I've got a couple poems to read and discuss, a couple short writing exercises that hopefully we'll get to. And then there are some additional poems and a longer writing exercise that you might want to look at for you to take home and do afterwards. Any thoughts or questions before we start? Any needs people have in terms of seeing the slides? All right. Then we'll dive in. Hearing none, we shall proceed. All right. So, first exercise, we're going to start you off with a little writing exercise, or you can just do it in your mind if you like. I'm going to put up on the next slide some words. I'd like you to read them silently to yourself and then write down several things that a person might mean by saying these these words. What did they really mean when they said this? You ready?
Well, they really mean get up and take out the garbage, I guess.
Okay, there's one. What else did anybody have? What did someone mean or imply when they're saying this?
Oh, did you take out?
Better get it done.
You
Yeah,
better get it done, right?
Yeah.
or it could be, did you get rid of your girlfriend or boyfriend?
Ooh. Oh.
Oh, okay. Or we could have like a little mafia meaning, right? Did you take out the
Yeah.
garbage? Right? Right. A lot of so what, sort of what are some other implications, like depending on how it's said, what might you be implying by these words?
Why do I have to ask?
Yeah, why do I have to ask? Right? Why do I always have to tell you this? Like, why are, so there's many things that just even these very simple words can imply. I have a couple of little vignettes here very quickly with on this theme, and just tell me what's going on that isn't specifically said, but that's clearly implied. So, bucket loads of backstory. So, he burst in the door in a cloud of long distance training sweat, checked his watch, paused before kicking off his running shoes. Trash day? She glanced up from chopping at the kitchen counter. Thanks, babe. So, what's going on? We've got three really short sentences here. Nothing was said about them, their relationship, the tenor of this conversation. What did you hear here? Who are these two people? What's going on? Dive
They really care about each other.
Yeah. How are you picturing them? Do you have an image? Like, who are they?
Sounds like a couple and in a fairly harmonious relationship and a regular routine.
Yep. So young couple, good vibe, and none of which is like said, right? But you get it from the text. Here's another one. Her eyes remain glued to the TV screen. It's Wednesday, she said, words slipping through her lips like ice chips. He was on his feet, reaching for the garbage bag and walking out to the curb before he had time to consider why he didn't just leave. What's going on here?
Not a happy relationship.
Yeah. Yeah.
He should have taken up jogging.
He should have been talking, right? So here she doesn't say, did you take the trash out? Or she says it's Wednesday, right? But the meaning, he knows what it meant. And as we read on, we know what it meant, even though it didn't say it. And we know this whole backstory of this trouble in this relationship here. This one may be more common. She swung the screen door open. The squeaking hinge stopped all conversation on the porch. Dave shoved something in his pocket. Mark waved smoke out of the air. She looked sharply at the garbage bags, then back at the boys. Dave rolled his eyes. All right, Mom. Jesus Christ, you don't have to yell. What's going on here? What's happening?
The sons are sneaking smokes.
Right? Yep. Yep. And again, not didn't even say, did you take the garbage out, but looks at the garbage bags and the response is, you don't have to yell, right? She didn't yell, but it's all implied. So these are just some examples of how you can what is not said implies in your prose or your poetry implies volume. So how do you, select the words and the form of your writing to imply volumes in addition to what's just in the text? So I'm going to exercise a lot of hubris here, because anybody who says they know what good poetry is, is lying. Obviously, it's really subjective. But to me, texture and subtext are what good poetry and prose are all about. I know it's fighting words, but to me, good writing is when there's a lot going on at the same time. You've got the text or the context, which is the subject matter. And then you've got the texture, which is the way that you choose to present that subject matter. And then you have the subtext, which is what you've built in that is being implied or that we all share and get from your text, even though it's not said. So the first element of that is texture. And what is texture? Britannica Online said texture is the concrete physical elements of prose or poetry separate from the structure or the argument of the work. So that includes metaphor, imagery, meter, rhyme, alliteration, consonants, assonance, the line length in poetry, the sentence length in your prose, the armature or the architecture of your writing, and looking at that as a separate issue from the content or the subject matter. I quoted in your materials from this book called Textual Tapestry, A Texture of Texts, in which Dilshan Bonge was writing about John Crowe Ransom, who was this famous literary critic who wrote this book, New Criticism, urging us to analyze poetry precisely and methodically by its texture, how it is written, not necessarily the subject matter, but the how it is presented. And he said that Ransom divides poetry into two parts, the logical core, or the text, the context, and the local texture. So the former being what it's about, the what of the poetry, the texture being the how it's written. And Ransom said you can't call texture just, texture's not just a frame or padding. It actually is intertwined with that subject matter. And if you select the right texture, you enforce and you really strengthen and further present that subject matter. What you're doing is creating layers of meaning that are appealing to different parts of your reader's brain. So you've got the subject matter, which is appealing intellectually as facts, but then you've got the texture, which is more like artwork, and it's appealing emotionally and to your visual senses and to your audio senses as you hear it read. So, like with a painting, you can have 5 different people painting the same landscape, and one's going to do it in flowy watercolors and another in really choppy, deep colors with a palette knife. And you're going to get a different emotional impression, even though the subject matter is the same. So that I wanted to start, I wanted to take a look at 2 really classic poems. And the first they're in your packet there. And we're just going to look at a couple of questions of what is the texture that the poet used in this. So the first one is Ozymandias by Percy Bysshe Shelley. This one was written around 1819, sonnet of sorts. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed, and on the pedestal these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. Now, this was written actually at a time when it was at a moment in time when the British Museum was looting. There really is no better word. Looting the artifacts of Sumeria and Egypt, and bringing back mountains of artifacts for the museum. And this was written in anticipation of the giant statue of Ramses II being transported to England. But what are some of the what are some of the aspects of texture? How is this poem presented? What about the structure of the poem stands out to you? What structure did he choose?
Seems very strident,
Strident.
sort of a dictator speaking.
Yeah. What else? What are some other interesting ways that he chooses to present this?
Well, there's an
Go ahead, Deanna.
anger.
Yeah. What about just the structure of it, though? He presents it as this is somebody else telling him something, right? I met this traveler from an antique land, and that is supposed to sort of imply some sort of mystery. This is some strange exotic foreigner that he met in the bar, started telling him about the statue out in the desert. And that, it clearly is about this, this statue of this king, and yet that whole kingdom is gone. Obviously, it has turned to sand. So how he conveys that, though, is this, yeah, it's very formal language. He's chosen a very formal structure, and at the time it was a structure, these sonnets are being used by the romantic poets of the era, to convey a story supposedly told to him by a traveler about a statue that supposedly exists in the desert. So it's creating these layers of mystique about it, and yet conveying the very obvious subtext that, everything the humans do passes, right? And even these giant and these incredible antique empires pass away. But he uses very formal, elevated, poetic language that was very, typical of that era. And it's interesting because but here's one interesting thing to me. Although it's a formal sonnet, the rhyme scheme is really jumbled. The rhyme scheme is not what was typical of that era. It's all sort of fractured and broken up. And I think that underscores this kind of fractured and broken up statue that he's trying to write about.
I
And
find
let's
it, I
yeah, go
find
ahead.
I find it hard to analyze without being able to see the poem,
See the
without being able to see the poem visually. It's sort of,
Okay, it's in your packet. That's why I sent it out. Yeah.
oh yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Um,
You
and
know,
here's
it looks like that every third line is rhyming. Is that right?
yeah, isn't it a little so like land and sand rhyme, stone and frown, kind of not really command
But
things and
it's
then kings. It's a very strange, it's choppy. It's kind of
not consistent. No.
it, it's not consistent, and that certainly would have been quite different for that time period. And it plays upon the fact that it's the inconsistent rhyme scheme and this inconsistent time of the narrative where you've got him telling you about a guy who's telling you about a statue and the statue is telling you about his empire, which is now gone, so you're getting this leaps in the time frame, and these leaps in the rhyme are kind of paralleling that. And here's just another, so 100 years later, William Butler Yeats, I don't know if there's any Yeats fans out there, his famous poem, The Second Coming, once again talking about a guy out in the desert. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming. Hardly are those words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs while all about it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle, and what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. So this is such quintessential Yeats because, to be honest, the text, that is what this poem is about, almost entirely vanishes inside of the texture, right? And that's something that's not uncommon in Celtic poetry. It is so wrapped in emotional metaphor and imagery that if you try to parse it out literally, you're like, what in the heck is this guy talking about, right? And yet at the same time, it's so profound and moving and gorgeous, right? But what the heck is it about? So it was written in 1919. It's really an emotional response to the devastation of World War One. He's in a Europe that's, you know, bombed out, and there's tons of homeless people and without work and whose homes were destroyed, you know, wandering around the landscape, waiting for a new world, you know, to be created. It's just something out of Dante, really. And this is his response. And the texture is so rich that at an emotional level, you get what he's saying. And yet, literally, in terms of the text, it's almost completely buried in the texture. And Yeats can pull that off, but boy, it's a fun thing to try to write that way because it's really hard. We default to the narrative. I want to tell you about what's happening. I want to tell you the story, you know, of what I'm looking at and what I'm seeing and how people are walking around and how all these buildings are destroyed and, you know, how the economy has crashed and whatever. And to leap from that to something like this is difficult for many of us. But this is an example of using texture to effectively supplant the text. I gotta love Yeats. All right, so that's texture. Let's talk about a little bit more about subtext. So what is subtext? So subtext is all the stuff that's not spoken. It's the unspoken or less obvious meaning in any sort of literary work. It can be immediately obvious, especially if it's based on like a shared living, you know, living experience, a shared cultural experience. It can be a little bit more hidden and really, you know, evolve later, and you have to talk it out and go, wait a minute, what was this really about? What was this person really saying? So the Merriam Dictionary Online definition gave this, it said it's that subtext is the implicit or metaphorical meaning as of a literary text. And they gave this example, which you'll all know immediately. A literary text often has more than one meaning. The literal meaning is the words on the page, and their hidden meaning, what exists between the lines, the subtext. Arthur Miller's play The Crucible, for example, is about the Salem witchcraft trials in the 17th century, but its subtext is the comparison of those trials with the witch hunts of the 1950s, which were the House Un-American Activities Committee and the people being unfairly accused of being communists. Even social conversation between a man and a woman may have subtext, and you may have to listen closely to figure out what it is. So you should know that subtext is also sometimes used academically to mean like the allusion or a metaphor to another text, like West Side Story. the subtext of West Side Story is Romeo and Juliet, right? It's taken a classic text, and so the subtext is actually a secondary text that's buried in it, and that's just kind of a variation of what we were talking about. I had recommended in some of those materials that I sent out this book, The Art of Syntax. And The Art of Syntax talks about meaning that is haunting the main text, right? It's a ghost or the spectral story or the spectral emotion that is haunting that main text. In that book, in The Art of Syntax, the author engages in quite an analysis of Robert Frost's poem, The Home Burial, which is a dialogue, and I've included that in your packet of materials. And that is a dialogue between a husband and wife regarding the burial of a child on their property, but it clearly has also caused a lot of strains in the marriage. What is Frost's other poem about the death of the hired man has a very similar subtext where you have a husband and wife having this conversation about a hired man who, after an elderly hired man who, after many years away, has come back to the farm looking for work, and then he dies in the poem. But these dialogues, there's so much subtext going on, and they give you so much backstory as to what has happened between these two people. But let me read for you a lesser known piece, and then we can talk about this one at some greater length. And this is the poem The War Horse by Evan Boland. Are there any Evan Boland fans here? If you're not familiar with her work, I really, really love her work. So I'll read for you The War Horse, which she wrote in 1975. And then you can tell me what it's about. The War Horse. This dry night, nothing unusual. About the clip-clop casual. Iron of his shoes as he stamps death like a mint on the innocent coinage of earth. I lift the window, watch the ambling feather of hawk and fetlock loosed from its daily tether. In the tinker camp on the Enniskerry road, pass his breath hissing, his snuffling head down. He is gone, no great harm is done. Only a leaf of our laurel hedge is torn. Of distant interest, like a maimed limb, only a rose which now will never climb. The stone of our house expendable, a mere line of defense against him, a volunteer, you might say, only a crocus, its bulbous head blown from growth, one of the screamless dead. But we are safe, our unformed fear of fierce commitment gone. Why should we care if a rose, a hedge, a crocus are uprooted like corpses, remote, crushed, mutilated? He stumbles on like a rumor of war, huge, threatening. Neighbors use the subterfuge of curtains. He stumbles down our short street, thankfully passing us. I pause, wait, then to breathe relief, lean on the sill, and for a second only my blood is still with atavism. That rose he smashed phrase ribboned across our hedge, recalling days of burned countryside, illicit braid, a cause ruined before, a world betrayed. So what is happening in this poem? What is the actual text? What is it about? What's the subject matter? What's she looking out her window at?
I think the aftermath of war.
Yeah. And what's she literally seeing out her window?
A rose, a hedge, a crocus.
Kind of the wrecked garden, and she's
Mhm.
sort of trying to justify
Yeah.
the war and remain hopeful for the future.
Mhm.
So this is one where text and subtext really braid together because she's literally looking out her window at a horse that ran away, right?
Mhm.
There's this tinker camp up the road and their horse keeps getting out and it runs through the neighborhood trampling everything.
Mhm.
Um, and in looking at the devastated garden, she's also looking back to a time when this same neighborhood in World War II had been, when it was tanks blasting through the neighborhood and bombs, not this horse. So she renames it a war horse because the horse is both the horse and it's the war. And it's almost like these two timelines are going on at once. Um, how do you think the style, these couplets, help get those two themes across, the text and the subtext? What do the fact that she put it in these rhyming couplets do?
I think it matches the plodding of the horse.
Mm-hmm.
It's a kind of a marching rhythm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, and
Yeah.
it's
Yep. Go ahead.
it's almost like each stanza could stand alone uh, and create its. You could go further with that stanza, I guess, if you wanted, to another poem.
Yep. Yep. And each of it's not entirely consistent, but in many of these couplets, there's one line that's about the horse and the garden or today, and there's another line that's about death and war. Um, of distant interest like a maimed limb, only a rose which will never climb. So like there's this you might say only a crocus, its bulbous head, right? That line is about the garden and the crocus. Blown from growth, one of the screamless dead, well, and that's about the war. If a rose, a hedge, a crocus are uprooted, that's about the garden today. And then like corpses remote, crushed, mutilated, that's about what it looked like, however many years prior it was. This was written in 75. So this is what it had looked like, 40 years, or rather 30 years earlier. So it's in a very subtle way, it's both orally kind of imitating the sound of this horse. And then it's also just braiding together these two images, and in many of them very clearly with each couplet is both. Each couplet is both text and subtext. So the hidden meaning is very neatly braided here, where it's not very hidden. It's really about both things at the same time. Other thoughts on that one?
I'm looking at it, and I just wonder if sometimes poems you can take the last stanza and take it to the top.
Yeah.
This could almost be one like that, I think.
Yeah.
Something to think about, I think.
Yeah. It's also always, well, it's interesting that you should say that, because in all of these and in the extra ones that I've sent you home with, the thoughts for discussion on those are always also involved looking at the first line, because the first line of any poem really should pull you into the world of the poem. Okay, science fiction authors get their whole first trilogy to, do their world building and tell you how their world works, right? We get one line, and that first line, the reader's got to be pulled into where the poem is. Yet when you're writing with a clear subtext, then how do you do it? Because you have to pull them into one world. But are you going to clue in the other world yet? So the interesting thing about this is that the first lines that she selected, this dry night, nothing unusual, about the clip clop casual, right? You're just in a suburban neighborhood hearing a horse, that's coming on the street, and she literally tells us there's nothing unusual, which is almost like a clue that, okay, this is going to be unusual, right? Had she selected, so the world she's chose to pull us into is the one that's like right now as she's writing in the garden. If she'd selected, and then he stamps death, and you're like, whoa, this is getting serious all of a sudden. If she'd started with that last stanza, the world she would have pulled us into to start would have been like the war world, and then she could have come in with the horse as sort of the secondary thing. So it is interesting that the change in those lines would have started us, the balance between the text and the subtext just would have started us on one or the other. And it certainly would have worked the other way. And then that's where you get a choice. That's where you get a choice of how the texture that you choose is going to frame that subtext. Which of this is going to be the subtext? So it's that, which do we use as the first line, and do we move the end? Those are great thoughts on that. So let's look a little more about how they work together, how this texture and the subtext work together to create these layers of meaning. And again, I'm sure you've all heard about like music therapy is so amazing. And a lot of times people who have even had a stroke or some sort of physical brain damage where they've had difficulty talking or difficulty walking. If you use music, some people who cannot walk can dance because it's a different part of your brain like that's triggered. Some people who cannot speak can sing. Here in Vermont, there's actually a aphasia music choir. And many people who have aphasia and difficulty speaking, that is, they can't find words, there's gaps in the speech elements of their brain, can sing perfectly. And getting the words out that way works fine. So what you're doing by thinking about how you're presenting your subject matter in terms of things like rhyme and line break and the lyricism of it begins to sound more like ritual or chant or music, and it's appealing to a different part of the brain. And then the way that you lay a poem or your sentences out in prose is once again it's embedding a little bit of rhythm and also visual impact in how it's laid out. So your poem or your piece of prose then begins to appeal to the reader in several different parts of their brain, and it's triggering memory, it's triggering anticipation, as well as hearing the subject matter. So it triggers different levels of your reader's receptivity. Rhyme and meter force memory. They force you to look forward to the next rhyme. Metaphor kind of creates this almost enchantment or magic cloak where, yeah, you're reading the story about the horse, but you're also cloaked in the story about the war. And it's almost like creates this almost fairy tale atmosphere. So let's see. I wrote two pieces here, that are, they're about exactly the same subject matter, and neither one of them is a great poem. I was just trying to show you like sort of two different ways of presenting thing. And the first is a pretty flat narrative. On my morning walk, I saw a dead chickadee at the side of the road, made me really sad, and all the way home I thought about death. Okay, so I've got line breaks there where, I've taken this prose, it's been broken into rather uniform lines, and, maybe you like the way that hits. Maybe the fact that it's dry, flat narrative gives some punch to that last line. I don't know. But it's pretty much reportage, really, more than more than it is poetical, and it doesn't have a lot of texture, and it really doesn't have a lot of subtext. It says what it is, right? Um, channeling my inner Yeats. Here's another variation. Inside dim light of early day, I saw a dead leaf tremble with the wake of passing cars. As I approached, I found that it was feathers pulled to flutter, a soft gray pulsing heart on black macadam. I lingered for a moment, then walked on my way. So exactly the same story, right? But what are the textural elements that are added to this one?
Well, it's certainly got magic in it.
Okay. What just
More,
in terms of poetical, poetical toolbox, what's going on in here?
well, more sensory elements.
Okay.
And
Well, the chickadee is not directly mentioned.
Yeah.
It's just feathers pulled to flutter that makes you think of a bird.
Yeah. Yeah. What are the other poetical elements being used?
Dim light of early day and morning.
Okay.
I think the ing words, passing, pulsing, um, also move it along, but give you a sense of movement in the poem.
Okay. This is more of a sense of movement. There's a lot of alliteration going on. Um, yeah, and a lot of suggestions. So you're right. Dim light of early day suggests morning. The feathers pulled to flutter suggests the bird, but they say it in a more obscured fashion. Um, with, you're right, a sense of movement, some sensory. This is, instead of saying I saw a dead chickadee, it shows you what was seen. And then that alliteration and some of these softer words, there's, look at the words, there's dead, there's wake, there's gray, there's flutter, there's black. All of these words are building a texture and a subtext about the emotion of this situation. Is there a subtext to this second one? Or is there a subtext to both of them? So what's the actual text? What's literally what's happening here?
Somebody's walking and a creature with feathers
Yeah.
falls to the ground.
Yeah.
So you understand that it's probably dying.
Yeah.
And then the narrator chooses to walk on,
Okay.
which is kind of mysterious, like, oh, the narrator didn't help the bird or didn't move it off the road. Maybe another car is going to run over it.
Oh.
So you're left with a question of possible scenarios.
Yeah. Okay. So that's the literal scenario. And even that literal scenario like raises questions like, well, what happened afterwards? Well, why didn't this person do this or that? And then sort of on a more philosophical level, what is it about?
Death.
Yeah,
Death,
I think that.
right? And what about death, particularly what?
Life goes on. I lingered for a moment and then walked on my way.
Yeah. You've got life goes on, processing death. You've got this fragility, and the fact that how easily we dismiss. You see some small thing that you didn't know, that died or that dropped in front of you, and you just go on, and then it's like, well, wait a minute, why did you go on? Like, how can we ignore these, deaths that we
I think
This
what makes
particular death made no impression on it, right? And how can that be? And he's like, wait a minute, this thing died and you're not doing anything about it. And it's like, oh, wait a minute, lots of people die and we don't do anything about it, right? So it has a, it has this sort of underlayment of suggestion. And it's not super dramatic. I mean, it's not like the 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 subtext here is subtle, and it's not, there's not one big specific story. It's not a dramatic metaphor for something else, but there is this suggestion of, yeah, wait a minute, we just encountered death and wandered away, and just walked off. Like, what is going on?
But
There,
in the second poem, where it says a pulsing heart, that means it's still alive.
yeah,
right.
yeah,
So, in the first poem, you know it's definitely dead because it
yeah,
says that. But here, it's still alive, and maybe there isn't anything you can do about that.
yeah.
I think what makes the second poem work and gives it texture are the active verbs.
Mm-hmm.
The trembling, the fluttering, the pulsing, the lingering. It paints a more complete picture.
Yep. Yep.
And
Good
Black
point.
Macadam is so much richer than Road.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, and isn't that in terms of thinking about texture, that's something we always wrestle with because you want to show, not tell. But then we also run into the trap of having a whole long list of adverbs, that that get to be cloggy and not quite the right word. So like black macadam is just like, it's hard. The sounds of the word, you get these nice hard consonants. And it's almost like it's this absolute. When a little bird hits the black macadam, like it's gone, it's dead. It's an absoluteness of hardness and harshness, that maybe Road doesn't quite convey. So there's a good example of choosing the word choice has a whole back package of backstory and emotion that it brings into the poem. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It could have been blood-stained black macadam.
Yeah. Yeah. It could have. Yeah. So there's tons of word choices, and that's, as poets we have an infinite array of word choices and of the how we present things. And one of the things I often hear, Deanna mentioned that we've been in this, Otter Creek Poets group, which has been going on for 20 some odd years now. And it's not infrequent that someone will bring in a poem that is very much a flat narrative, an observation of something that they saw or experienced. And when others try to make suggestions about, you could try something else, people say, well, but that's what really happened. And so I guess what I'm encouraging you to do is think there is the what's really happened or what you really want to write about. And that's the text. But then the next question is how? How are you going to choose to present it? You could present it as dialogue. You could present it like Percy Bysshe Shelley did in Ozymandias and say like, hey, this guy told me this thing. What does that do to it? It changes the texture. You could couch it in rhyme and meter, and how would that change the texture? Does it help? Does it not help? Depends on the subject matter and how you want to present it. So just because you want to write a poem about this chickadee you saw dead on the side of the road, you have an infinite array of ways to do that. And you can use it as metaphor or suggestion of a very, very broad array of other things. So I want to read to you, I'm gonna beg you to indulge me because I'm gonna read you a very long poem, and it is in your materials. It is a contemporary poem by Layli Long Soldier, and her book, Whereas, in 2017. I'm trying to remember. I know it was nominated for, I'm trying to remember if it won the National Book Award. It's won quite a number of awards. And the book, Whereas, mainly takes there was in the mid 2000s, a proclamation of apology to Native Americans that was issued by the United States government. But it had never been announced. There was no like signing ceremony, and it got read at some conference by the BIA at some point, but it was never actually like delivered to the people it was purportedly addressed to. And Layli Long Soldier's book, Whereas, takes that proclamation and all its whereas clauses and basically blows it apart and writes some incredibly powerful sort of combination of erasure poems and found poems and her own works. And then this is another piece in that book called 38. It is very long. It takes me about 8 minutes to read it. But I think in terms of texture and subtext, I've never seen a poem quite like this. And I think it's really important. So I'd like to share it with you. Again, it is in your material.
I think it's very difficult, Cindy, because for me, I didn't print out those materials.
Okay.
I just kept them, in a file to go back to after this. So I think, without it being on and sharing it, it's very, very difficult, at least for me, to
Okay.
to do this.
So hang on one second, and I can bring that poem up.
Yeah, and I opened it in my computer, so
Yeah, and I don't know how to do that.
Yeah. So I will pull it up on the screen for you.
Well, a lot of us are visual learners.
All right. Here we go. Can you see it now?
Yes, thank you.
Layli Long Soldier, this is called 38. Here, the sentence will be respected. I will compose each sentence with care by minding what the rules of writing dictate. For example, all sentences will begin with capital letters. Likewise, the history of the sentence will be honored by ending each one with appropriate punctuation, such as a period or question mark, thus bringing the idea to momentary completion. You may like to know, I do not consider this a creative piece. I do not regard this as a poem of great imagination or a work of fiction. Also, historical events will not be dramatized for an interesting read. Therefore, I feel most responsible to the orderly sentence, conveyor of thought. That said, I will begin. You may or may not have heard about the Dakota 38. If this is the first time you've heard of it, you might wonder, what is the Dakota 38? The Dakota 38 refers to 38 Dakota men who were executed by hanging under orders from President Abraham Lincoln. To date, this is the largest legal mass execution in U.S. history. The hanging took place on December 26, 1862, the day after Christmas. This was the same week that President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. In the preceding sentence, I italicize "same week" for emphasis. There was a movie titled Lincoln about the presidency of Abraham Lincoln. The signing of the Emancipation Proclamation was included in the film Lincoln. The hanging of the Dakota 38 was not. In any case, you might be asking, why were 38 Dakota men hung? As a side note, the past tense of hang is hung, but when referring to the capital punishment of hanging, the correct past tense is hanged. So it's possible that you're asking, why were 38 Dakota men hanged? They were hanged for the Sioux Uprising. I want to tell you about the Sioux Uprising, but I don't know where to begin. I may jump around and details will not unfold in chronological order. Keep in mind, I am not a historian, so I will recount facts as best I can given limited resources and understanding. Before Minnesota was a state, the Minnesota region, generally speaking, was the traditional homeland for Dakota, Anishinaabe, and Ho-Chunk people. During the 1800s, when the U.S. expanded territory, they purchased land from the Dakota people as well as other tribes. But another way to understand that sort of purchase is Dakota leaders ceded land to the U.S. government in exchange for money or goods, but most importantly, the safety of their people. Some say that Dakota leaders did not understand the terms they were entering, or they never would have agreed. Even others called the entire negotiation trickery. But to make whatever it was official and binding, the U.S. government drew up an initial treaty. This treaty was later replaced by another, more convenient treaty, and then another. I've had difficulty unraveling the terms of these treaties given the legal speak and congressional language. As treaties were abrogated, broken, and new treaties were drafted one after another, the new treaties often referenced old defunct treaties, and it is a muddy switchback trail to follow. Although I often feel lost on this trail, I know that I am not alone. However, as best as I can put the facts together, in 1851, Dakota Territory was contained to a 12-mile by 150-mile long strip on the Minnesota River. But just 7 years later, in 1858, the northern portion was ceded, taken, and the southern portion was conveniently allotted, which reduced Dakota land to a stark 10-mile tract. These amended and broken treaties are often referred to as the Minnesota Treaties. The word Minnesota comes from Mini, which means water, and soda, which means turbid. Synonyms for turbid include muddy, unclear, cloudy, confused, and smoky. Everything is in the language we use. For example, a treaty is essentially a contract between two sovereign nations. The U.S. treaties with the Dakota Nation were legal contracts that promised money. It could be said this money was payment for the land the Dakota ceded, for living within assigned boundaries, a reservation, and for relinquishing rights to their vast hunting territory, which in turn made Dakota people dependent on other means to survive, money. The previous sentence is circular, akin to so many aspects of history. As you may have guessed by now, the money promised in the turbid treaties did not make it into the hands of Dakota people. In addition, local government traders would not offer credit to Indians to purchase food or goods. Without money, store credit, or rights to hunt beyond their 10-mile tract of land, Dakota people began to starve. The Dakota people were starving. The Dakota people starved. In the preceding sentence, the word starved does not need italics for emphasis. One should read the Dakota people starved as a straightforward and plainly stated fact. As a result, and without other options but to continue to starve, Dakota people retaliated. Dakota warriors organized, struck out, and killed settlers and traders. This revolt is called the Sioux Uprising. Eventually, the U.S. cavalry came to Minnesota to confront the uprising. More than 1,000 Dakota people were sent to prison. As already mentioned, 38 Dakota men were subsequently hanged. After the hanging, those 1,000 Dakota prisoners were released. However, as a further consequence, what remained of Dakota territory in Minnesota was dissolved, stolen. The Dakota people had no land to return to. This means they were exiled. Homeless, the Dakota people of Minnesota were relocated, forced, onto reservations in South Dakota and Nebraska. Now every year, a group called the Dakota 38+2 Riders conduct a memorial horse ride from Lower Brule, South Dakota to Mankota, Minnesota. The memorial riders travel 325 miles on horseback for 18 days, sometimes through sub-zero blizzards. They conclude their journey on December 26th, the day of the hanging. Memorials help focus our memory on particular people or events. Often memorials come in the form of plaques, statues, or gravestones. The memorial for the Dakota 38 is not an object inscribed with words, but an act. Yet I started this piece because I was interested in writing about grasses. So there's one other event to include, although it's not in chronological order, and we must backtrack a little. When the Dakota people were starving, as you may remember, government traders would not extend store credit to Indians. One trader named Andrew Myrick is famous for his refusal to provide credit to Dakota people by saying, "If they're hungry, let them eat grass." There are variations of Myrick's words, but they are all something to that effect. When settlers and traders were killed during the Sioux Uprising, one of the first to be executed by the Dakota was Andrew Myrick. When Myrick's body was found, his mouth was stuffed with grass. I am inclined to call this act by the Dakota warriors a poem. There's irony in their poem. There was no text. Real poems do not really require words. I have italicized the previous sentence to indicate inner dialogue, a revealing moment. But on second thoughts, the words "let them eat grass" click the gears of this poem into place. So we could also say language and word choice are crucial to the poem's work. Things are circling back again. Sometimes when in a circle, if I wish to exit, I must leap and let the body swing from the platform out to the grasses. So let me ask you this. Who is in terms of the texture of this, who is the narrator? Who is speaking and who are they speaking to?
I think the poet speaking to whomever will listen.
Okay. Okay. And what is the narrative tone? How has this poet, how has Lady Long Soldier chosen to frame this particular poem?
Well, he frames it as a tale about how to make a poem and how to compose it and he talks about the sentence structure and the periods and the punctuation. And I think it's brilliant that he's talking about the poem and telling you how to create a poem, but he's really telling you about these horrible events.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's it's framed either as a how to write, or I almost sometimes I hear it almost as like a book report, right? Like um it's about, and it is that what is that one sentence in the middle that really is everything is in the language we use, right? That's the pivot point of this whole poem. Um is everything is in the language, and it keeps reflecting back on the language. You're right. It keeps reflecting back on the language almost like a how-to manual, right? You put certain words in italics, you put certain words in quote, why? To emphasize them, to look back and look at the structure of your sentences and how you are saying something. Why do you think, or how do you think that supports the subject matter here? How did this choice to tell this story in this almost arm's length, I'm going to tell you the story of the Dakota 38 in the framework of telling you how to write a poem and why the structure of a poem is important. Why make that choice, do you think?
It really leaves the interpretation of the events up to the reader or the listener of the poem. And so there's a lot of rather than the poet imposing their take on these things, it totally leaves it up to the person listening to engage with the poem and monitor your own reactions to the words, which is really, really interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's a very sarcastic, sardonic way to grab the reader and not just tell them up outright
Yeah.
about the 38 Dakota
Yeah.
and the background story of it. He's not just out to tell you, isn't this horrible? He's out to say, hey, look at this.
Yeah. So you mentioned the word sarcastic. What is it that's striking you as sarcasm in it?
Well, it's sarcastic because the how to compose a sentence is, I find that to be sarcastic.
Yeah.
How to, all of the talk about how to compose a poem is sarcastic to me. I don't know
Yeah.
how else to say it.
Yeah.
I think the first sentence, here the sentence will be respected, but when you finish reading it, you realize that the Dakota were not.
Yeah. What do you think the poet's emotion is? What do you think the poet's real emotion is?
Anger.
I saw the poem in the context of Native American storytelling, and which is an oral tradition of
Yeah.
history telling. And 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 yet it's also one of the things that struck me, just touched my heart so deeply was there's storytelling in the Lakota sense, Lakota Sioux sense, and then there's also the storytelling that the film Lincoln that he mentions had, and I was like, oh my gosh, I saw that film and I knew nothing about this chapter. So, there's a lot of room for the audience to engage with these sentences, with the topics mentioned or unmentioned, and yet it creates a lot of emotional impact despite the dispassionate recounting.
Yeah. And that, to me, that is part of the brilliance of this poem. I was really blown away, and I really thank you so much for bearing with me for reading it. It really is a long poem, and yet it just keeps pulling you in, and then these snappy little comebacks about reflecting on, the word structure and stuff, just really keep moving you along on it. But I also got the sense that there was profound anger here. And that this poem, for all its beautiful, perfect sentence structure and writing, is pretty much like a scream, right? Of outrage. And yet, had it been written as a scream of frustration and outrage and anger, it likely would not have been as effective, would it? Do you think it would have been effective? And why not? What would many readers' reactions have been if it had have been if it had been a rant, if it had been a long rant about mistreatment and murder and broken treaties and, life's not fair for certain groups of people, like what would the reader response be, do you think?
Well, we would be horrified. We have heard so many stories like this.
Yeah.
And he took it he made it into a different framework, which made all the difference.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I feel like perhaps it's, the rants haven't gotten anywhere, right? They haven't touched people in a way that has, created effective responses. And maybe this, appealing on a much more, intellectual and academic layer, may do so. And I think that it's easy to marginalize, rants or an emotional appeal. And so this has made this very distinct stated intention of we're not going to be emotional. This isn't a creative piece. It's not a poem. It's not a work of fiction. I'm just going to write you this little essay of facts where you're not going to be able to dispute any single sentence in here. Every single one is going to be a clear sentence written of plain, straightforward fact. And yet we're going to tell this emotionally devastating story of intense anger, intense betrayal, a moment that has been, buried in history. I also think it's a lot about language. Um, and in referring back, there's just a couple of subtle references to the Native American language and what these places were called, in the native language. Um, so there's also a sense of, although it's not said at all, we were compelled to speak English. We were sent to English speaking schools. We were told to write a certain way in, the English language. And so, fine, you want me to write sentences? I can write damn beautiful sentences and they're all going to be perfect and they're going to be just the way you told me to write them. And, here is what I am going to do with them. So there's a kind of a taking this, the language that was imposed and then using it in this empowering way, like turning it back and saying, okay, I got really good at using your sentence structure, and here's what I'm going to tell you in it. And there's no way for you to, rebut that. So for such a flat narrative tone, it conveys so much on so many different levels. And these reflections back into the language, I italicized same week for emphasis, this kind of correcting people, the fact that we always say hung when we're actually grammatically incorrect, it's hanged. There's these little jives about the language. Anyway, I love this. I love this poem intently. And the fact that it talks about poetry, this point at the end of real poems do not really require words. What do you think about that? What do you think she meant? Or how does that resonate with you?
That's you the to indicate inner dialogue, meaning that the inner dialogue is so strong, you feel it so strongly that you don't really require words.
Yeah.
I think when Merrick's body was found, his mouth was stuffed with grass. That's a poem.
Yeah.
Yeah. What do you think? Does that
require words?
Does that make sense to you? The real poems do not really require words. What springs to mind with that?
Well, a flower can be a poem, a cloud can be a poem, and we're just trying to replicate the feeling that we get seeing and experiencing these things. But we can't really replicate it.
Yeah, I think that's an extraordinarily important point. And, the fact that so these folks murdered this traitor named Andrew Mayak and stuffed his mouth with grass. I mean, it's horrible, and it's also justice or it's also an act of such profound frustration, an act that is arising out of such profound emotion that she views it as a poem. And as a poem, it's what? It's both horrible and not beautiful, but like that, well, that the Yeats expression, a terrible beauty, a terrible beauty is born, that it's this horror that has this aesthetic resonance that that a poem ought to have and that we're striving for. And we feel it first before we try to put it into words. Does that
It's
make sense?
also karma.
Yeah,
Karma?
I thought that too. Poetic justice.
Yeah.
Poetic justice, right? There's a term that we use. And it's a lot of food for thought. Anyway. So here, I love this poem because I think it really is that example of there's surface, but there's what's being said on the surface. There's tons of backstory and art and culture and history being implied by these very flat, clear, perfectly written sentences. And then it's also got this texture of being a how-to and in the guise of, reportage rather than a poem. And yet it really is a poem, a very profound poem. But it doesn't have the rhyme or meter or alliteration or consonants or assonance as its texture. It has grammatically correct sentences as its texture, deliberately chosen to be that way. And that to me is so interesting. It's just shows a really innovative use of combining all of that text, texture, and subtext to create something that is really quite powerful. I really strongly suggest if you care to that you get her book, Whereas, because there's more where this came from, and it's kind of like every one of them is like you kind of read it and then just have to sit with it for a little while and then go back and think about not only the subject matter, which is very new to many of us, but her approaches and this kind of texture that she brings to it is really quite intriguing. And she does this turning your language back on you thing repeatedly in ways that I think we all can take away a lot in our own writing, on totally different subjects. But this idea of reflecting on how we have chosen our words and our structure, I think is very, very helpful. Let me go back to my little PowerPoint here as we go forward. All right. Okay, any other last thoughts on Layli Long Soldier's poem 38?
I like the fact that it's a combination of internal dialogue with historic facts, and when he talks about the words not being necessary for a poem, then 2 lines later says, on second thought. Yeah. So it's a lot of talking to oneself.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So let's move on. Let's leave that very dark or very deep subject matter behind and do another quick writing exercise here. So, if one of the other books that I had suggested in those materials were Queneau's Exercises in Style. This is a great book to have on your shelf, and if you get writer's block or keep in the car for when you have 10 minutes to work on something, what Queneau's Exercises in Style does is he just took one little vignette. It's like somebody waiting for a bus. And he rewrote it in like 150 different styles. So it's written as like film noir. It's written as like a doctor's report. It's written as like a press release. It's written as a romance novel. Like just took this little paragraph. And one fun thing to do at home is just like write your own little paragraph, just like 3 sentences, and then randomly flip his book open to a style and try to rewrite your 3 sentences in that style just by shifting the language to create a very different tone. It's a really wonderful book. So I had this little mini exercise for us to do along those lines, which is to just in a few words, we've got a person wearing red lipstick. And what I'd like you to do is write in just a few words, a phrase or a sentence. Pick any one of these on the chart and describe describe this face wearing red lipstick. And my example was an angry middle-aged woman, that'd be me, 2 slashes of cheap scarlet gnashed above her chin. So those word choices, I don't say lipstick, I don't say lips, but slashes, scarlet, gnashed, right? I'm describing that. So pick one or two of these others, write a phrase or two, and then we'll try to guess which one you were describing. So I'll give you a few minutes to do that. Yeah, just another one more minute here. All right. Who has one they'd like to share? Dive on in.
Oh, I'll do one.
Go ahead. Throw one out there.
Okay. Whoops, something's happened here on my computer.
Oh no.
Okay. I don't know what happened. Okay, it's Anne. Um, the ruby lips move, but the sounds are intelligible.
Want to take a guess on which one she was describing?
Could you read it again, Anne?
The ruby lips move, but the sounds are intelligible.
Somebody got a guess?
A neurosurgeon?
Yes.
Yeah, so what made you guess that?
Unintelligible sounds.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Who's got another one?
Lips ruby red, bursting into song.
Who can guess?
A grandmother at church?
I think
Could be.
singer.
A singer in the choir.
Choir, right? Yep. We're liking that Ruby, right? Who's got another one?
The grimace reveals his frustration at the length of the transfer station line.
Ooh. Got a guess on there. Any guesses?
Dump truck driver?
That's right.
All right. Who's got another one?
I have one.
Go for it.
She dances in ecstasy, a pink princess in oversized high heels, one red, one blue.
A child playing
drag queen?
Yeah,
Child playing dress up.
that's one of my granddaughters when she was little.
Yeah.
Oh.
Okay, who's got one we haven't done yet?
I've got one. Alert eyes encased in Spider-Man dark glasses. Muscled arms allowing rough-skinned hands to safely guide.
Guesses?
Say it one more time.
Alert gray eyes encased in Spider-Man dark glasses. Muscled arms allowing rough-skinned hands to safely guide.
The police sergeant?
Dump
the
truck
sniper. The
driver.
sniper. Sniper. Yeah.
The dump truck driver has
Oh,
to have
dump-
alert eyes and good hands.
Anyone else? Let's do one more here.
As the little girl was dressing up for Halloween, she couldn't stop chewing on the wax lips.
Oh, that's good.
Okay. Well, I do again I urge you to get a hold of that book, The Exercises in Style. And you know what? You can find it on thrift books or used for just a couple of bucks. I'm trying to remember. It was originally written in French, but it was translated into English probably 20 years ago, and there's a lot of little paperback copies floating around. It used to be used in English classes, but this is the kind of thing where you'd take something like lips with red lipstick and then describe it in so many different ways that you can create very different impressions just by that short little description. And using that exercises in style, I think, is really handy. Even just reading through it is a lot of fun, just to get the idea of how many different ways you can say something and what an incredible impression those changes make. So we don't have time to get through this long. I didn't think we would have time to get through this long exercise, but this is something I encourage you to do at home, either yourself or it's great to do it in a group and then see if you have effectively conveyed that the emotion that you're talking about. And this is creating a texture, subtext roadmap for your writing in what I have it in your materials. Oops, I hadn't spelled it out on the sides. But you basically create 3 columns on the page. And in terms of an emotion, I have a whole list of things to write down that if that emotion were a color, what would it be? If it was an animal, what would it be? If it was an object, what would it be? And then write down a bunch of synonyms for your emotion that you've thought about. And then try to draft a description or try to draft some prose or a poem without using the word for that emotion, but drawing on all these lists that you've made. So, as when we went back and did that little flat narrative, the chickadee thing, and we were talking about gray and fluttering and black macadam and, these things that were conveying grief or death, without saying that word. So if you think of an emotion like jealousy or anger or curiosity or joy, and then work through this little exercise and then try to write a poem or a few sentences without using the word for the emotion, but that conveys that emotion. And then read it to other people and see if they can tell very clearly what was the emotion you were trying to convey. So it's a great little workshop group, or something you can do at home and then bring back in and, see if people can understand what it was that you were aiming for if you effectively captured that emotion in texture and subtext without overtly stating what it was. So, we are close to out of time. I just wanted to sort of pull that all together and say that to me, texture and subtext really elevate your writing by trying to engage the reader on multiple levels. You've got the intellectual flat level of the text. You're telling them what happened or what you saw. And then the texture starts appealing like music to other parts of your brain, and then the subtext emotionally hits you with there's more going on here than is on the surface. I was thinking about Deanna's poetry. I don't know. I hope that some of you have heard some of Deanna's Walking in Manhattan poems. And I've been thinking about those a lot because they're another great example of how this works. Although Deanna is engaging in this narrative, the framing that she has chosen for it is this very interesting, vibrant, personal conversation. Oh, look, there's the door to the gallery. Oh, now I'm looking at, oh, check this out. Now look at this painting, right? So she's the voice of it, the framing of it, the texture of it is as a guide, but there's also so much going on. She's telling us about Manhattan. She's telling us about art and art supplies and art museums, but her selection, the way she selects these pieces and the context of it is also so carefully curated that it leaves us with this almost a subtext of our own memories and times past, a kind of wistful sensation of looking back at life. What are the things that what are the paintings that stand out that you remember? What is the texture of the streets that you remember from your childhood? And there's something very wistful and poignant about that, that's going on as an emotional subtext to all of that. So they're very, very rich. So it's again, the narrative tone in an almost dialogue fashion has created this wonderful texture that I think brings so much richness to them and is another great example of this. So what do you think? Is there anything in here that you'll take away in your writing that maybe was helpful, inspiring, something you're going to try?
I'm interested in that book that you talked about with
Yeah.
the different, because I use Rhyme Zone a lot.
Yes, yes, I do as well.
And that book sounds like something that would go with that. And
Mhm. Good. All right. Well, in your
I just wanted to say, I think, Lee, the poem that you read at Art Fusion had a lot of these elements that were unsaid, but implied by all the words that you used. And I know you may have been afraid that people were going to have a negative reaction to it, but they certainly did not, because I think they brought their own feelings to the words that you did use and the subtext of it. So I think that, to me, that was an excellent example of what Cindy was saying in part of this talk, and I don't remember which part, but uh, but
yeah, and subtext is a great way to get to difficult topics too, where you're not tackling them head on. And I think that was part of Layli Long Soldier's, poem, is that if she came out just, sort of guns blaring to talk about this topic that a lot of people are going to respond defensively to or get upset about, or, that it's harder to do that. And so, couching it in terms of this subtext and this sort of roundabout approach, allows it to sink in to people on a different level, and then it lets people react to it on a different level as well. So that can be very effective. All right. Well, I left some more poems, and there's some more poems in the packet for you, along with some, questions to guide your thoughts on looking at that, the texture and the subtext in them. And I gave you my contact info as well. So any other thoughts, questions about anything, just about anything? I'm not good at math, but anything other than math?
Thank you very much. It was a really well prepared workshop and given me lots to think about.
I know there were some people that could not be here with us today who will listen to this recording and go through the packet as they do. So I want to thank you, just as Denise said, for being so thorough and engaging us and giving us interesting things to challenge us and write about it in short ways that we could share with each other. So thank you very much, Cindy.
Well, thank you for letting me invade your group on this lovely Saturday. And now it's all my neighbors are heading out to rallies. Now it's rally day here. So
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, there's
Here-
actually
here
one in
too.
Englewood. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you all so much. My contact info is there. I'd love to, hear from you, or, if something, or if you write something inspired by any of this or from the books I suggested or something, I'd love to hear from you. That'd be awesome.
Yeah. Thanks, Cindy.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Yeah.
Awesome.
I wanted to ask Elizabeth, how did you find out about us?
Online. I'm from actually Charlotte County, but there aren't any writers groups in Charlotte County. So I looked for the closest. I'm closer to Northport area. So found you and you're online. So here I am.
Oh, wonderful. Well,
Welcome.
we hope you'll join our group, and we would love to, have you on our Zoom meetings if you can't come to our in-service meetings in Venice, excuse me.
Yeah, it's harder for me to get anywhere, like actually get somewhere on Saturdays because I usually do my long runs on Saturdays, but I am in the long writers group. So I've been participating in that for 2 months now, I think.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes. And,
Okay,
and,
I
and
didn't realize you were a member. I've tried to catch up with all the new members, but
yeah.
I just haven't been able to do that as much as I would like to.
And
So,
Elizabeth,
welcome.
the Native American theme must have resonated with you.
It definitely did.
Yeah.
My book that I'm writing is about a family from a reservation in northern Minnesota. So
Wow.
that poem was great. I mean, not great, but it definitely resonated.
If any of you hadn't seen it, I don't know if any of you subscribe to Poetry, the journal that's just called Poetry, but this month's edition of Poetry featured all Native American poems, some in English, some in native languages, some in both, and there were some extraordinary essays about language and culture and what it means to reclaim language and write in language that had been prohibited, and how different members of the community feel about English versus their native language and learning in it. Really insightful essays. So it's got kind of like a burnt orange cover, but your library should have it if you don't subscribe to it, or an academic, if there's a college library around that probably subscribes to it. This edition was really extraordinary on that, and you might find some very interesting material.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Well, I'm going to say goodbye. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you, Gloria.
Oh, you're welcome.